Joining me here at the big table now is GW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker. Richard, let's talk about the human element here first. I mean, how important is it that these two presidents are sitting down and talking face to face?
Well, it's very important. I mean, I think both sides kind of acknowledge that the relationship with the other is really the most important relationship, the most consequential relationship in the world. These are the two most powerful countries in the world. And this is only the second time in Joe Biden's presidency, roughly 3 years in office, that he's actually had a face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping. And the last time was almost exactly a year ago, as Joe Biden said in his introductory comments there. And I think kind of what's interesting is that the message you were getting from the Americans a year ago when they met at Bali on the sidelines of the G20 summit, the message they were giving then is almost exactly the same messages they're giving now. Like, we need to kind of give a shape to this relationship where competition is intense, but it doesn't veer into conflict.
It's almost like they're crying wolf, though, in a way, right? The sky's falling all the time.
Well, it's almost like the problems that they were discussing a year ago are exactly the same problems now. And actually, during the course of that year, the situation got even worse. So it shows just how important it is that they really tried to put, as Biden sometimes says, kind of put a floor on the tensions in the relationship. From the American point of view, especially, that's very much it. The Chinese are playing a massive game of catch-up in military terms, and they're still not on a level with the US. But they have, in terms of the Navy, for instance, they've actually overtaken the US in terms of the actual sheer number of ships in the Navy, not yet on quite the same level of ships. But what the Americans are concerned about, and I think what many regional powers in Asia are concerned about too, is the risk of accidental conflict between the two sides. And this is because, and particularly in the South China Sea, there are more and more of what are called near misses between American planes which are patrolling in international skies and Chinese planes and fighter jets that are getting closer and closer and basically kind of buzzing these American planes with the Chinese message, essentially, get out of our backyard. What are you doing here? And this is happening on the high seas as well. So it's in the air and on the sea. Many near misses. And the Americans have said that there were 180 of these near misses in the last 2 years. So these are happening on a very regular basis. Now, the concern is that what happens if two of those planes collide in the air, someone's killed? What happens if a ship collides with another? Some people are killed. How do you deal with a situation like that? And because relations are so bad, the Chinese broke off military to military communications a year ago, just over a year ago.
They weren't answering the phone, right?
That's right. They haven't been answering the phone. So this is one of the American asks here, is to say, come on, we have to, this has to be an absolute minimum. Our militaries must be able to communicate with each other when you come into unexpected situations.
And I mean, these tensions, they seem to be a part of the DNA of this relationship. These countries, they've spent, what, the past 40 years marrying their economic manufacturing and supply chains, right?
Yeah.
And so what are they doing now in California? Are they talking about divorce?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, some people even coined the term Chimerica to describe just how closely intertwined the two economies became, with China exporting lots of relatively low-cost products into the United States, and also buying a lot of American Treasury bonds in the process. There is now this kind of process or this discussion of either, maybe we can talk about this, either kind of decoupling that relationship, or at the very least is the new parlance de-risking the relationship. But for this meeting to be happening in California, I think it's quite symbolic. The governor of California was very recently in China on a pretty much of a schmoozy kind of tour of China. The big titans like Tesla, Apple, they are highly integrated into the Chinese economy. They have a massive stake in this relationship remaining on an even keel. So yeah, interesting from that point of view too.
Richard, another way to say that, we're not trying to decouple from China. Instead, we're trying to de-risk this relationship. So what's the difference, if there is one?
Well, if you talk to people in China, and I was just recently there, I mean, they see this new term de-risking instead of decoupling. They think that this is just basically the same thing dressed up with a different word. But it does indicate that there has been a bit of movement in the debate within not just the United States, but in Europe as well. This is very much a discussion. Thinking about whether they got, and this is partly informed by the experience of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you know, a country like Germany realizes we were way too dependent on Russian energy. And are we dependent on similar things, whether it's technology, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's all kinds of things? Are we dependent to an excessive extent on China for those things? The debate in the United States is even further along. And their answer to that is basically yes. And they are trying to kind of onshore battery production for EVs. They're trying to onshore bring back all sorts of manufacturing. And I think from a Chinese point of view, they sort of see this in a direction of going, well, okay, you are trying to decouple by another term. What you hear from experts in the United States and also in Europe is actually, if you look at what China is doing, they're doing their own decoupling too. That there's also an effort to bring like high-tech chip production, stuff like that, back to China to own the IP, the intellectual property behind those things. So you are seeing a bit of a drift apart of these two economic systems.
And where does that leave Europe, especially Germany, an export economy that needs the Chinese market?
Yeah, and certainly, like, Germany is heavily invested in China, especially the car industry, which is, like, in the last 20 years, well, actually, Germany's car industry, its involvement in China goes back decades, way back into the 70s and 80s. And they look at this trend and they're very worried. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, all those companies make a huge amount of money in China. They worried about everything from, okay, what happens if there's like a Taiwan invasion scenario? What happens to all those factories? Are they suddenly, you know, cut off just the way that international companies have been cut off from the Russian market after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? But they're also worried about what happens if, so at the moment, for instance, the European Union has launched an investigation into Chinese EVs, whether they are electric vehicles, whether they are unfairly subsidized, whether they are being sold at kind of dumping prices into Europe. German car manufacturers are worried about that because they think, what if China retaliates to that and cuts us out of the Chinese market? So certainly for a country like Germany, a lot of angst around this whole subject.
All right, for more now, I'm joined by Alan Carlson. He's an associate professor in government at Cornell University. Mr. Carlson, it's good to have you with us. The U.S. President, Mr. Biden, he went into this meeting to mend strained ties with China. How far did he get?
He went a ways. Direction. But the fact of the matter is there are fundamental underlying differences between the two countries. And so it's not just that he used the term dictator, something you said before, but the domestic responses here to the overtures he's made. And if you look at the Chinese media, too, there's been a little bit of pushback to the more peaceful language which Xi used while he was in the United States.
Well, let me just pick up on what he did say. He did, said he is a dictator. And I mean, that is the truth. He's certainly not a democratically elected leader, but that may not have been the most diplomatic thing to say. Do you think that that damaged any progress that was made earlier in those face-to-face meetings?
I don't think so. I mean, we know that President Biden is not a wordsmith. And so sometimes his choice of words is a little bit off. That happens to all of us all the time. And the definition of a dictator is also something which people in my profession debate all the time. It's not like we agree. I think the main thing is that Xi is a different type of leader than his predecessors, immediate predecessors in China. But he's also nowhere near the kind of prototypical dictators of the past, people like Mao or Stalin. And so I think Biden's trying to point that out and, maybe got his lines flubbed a little bit, but that happens to all of us all the time. And I think it's going to cause a problem with China.
And so they did agree to reestablish direct communications on a military level. What about tensions over Taiwan? Did you see any progress made over that island?
No, there's very little room for progress. I think at best the two sides can agree to disagree. Fundamentally, they see the status of Taiwan differently. What does happen is I think the temperature has been dialed down a bit, but there's always things moving forward in Congress in terms of supporting Taiwan. And there are always measures which China is taking to demonstrate its resolve to bring what they see as their territory back under their governance. And so this is a perennial issue. It's been there when Nixon met Mao. It'll be there whoever comes next. It's not going away.
The U.S. says it doesn't want to decouple its economy from China, but it does want to de-risk the relationship. Considering that and the fact that China is not boasting economic growth that it was used to for several decades, was China going into these talks in a weaker position?
I think it's more the leadership of both countries have maybe come to the realization that we need each other, even if we don't like each other that well. I think it's twofold. One is the security situation around the globe right now is incredibly precarious, and not wanting to throw another log on that fire by escalating conflict between our two sides. And the global economy is also fragile, and that's not going to benefit anyone. And so I think the image, the optics of cooperation are important in trying to reassure the global population and reassure markets that things are okay.
Kelly Grieco is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Among other things, her work looks at U.S. security policy in the Indo-Pacific region. Ms. Grieco, it's good to have you with us. First things first, I just want to get your reaction to what has been getting a lot of attention today, and that is President Biden referring to Xi Jinping after their talks as a dictator.
Yes, well, first, thank you for having me. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of coverage today around those comments from President Biden. I think what is going to be really interesting is to see the Chinese response to it. In particular, in the past, they've responded very strongly to these kinds of statements. And I think it would be, of course, really unfortunate if some of the progress that they made during the discussions yesterday, if it got undermined by sort of a diplomatic blowback from those remarks. I think both sides have become increasingly very concerned about the possibility of ending in some kind of accidental escalation, that there would be some kind of incident either in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea where there's just an accident, that aircraft or ships get too close together and then it very quickly spirals out of control. There was an incident with a B-52 that was doing a freedom navigation mission and that a fighter aircraft got within 10 feet of it. That's very dangerous. And so, even during the course of the Ukraine war, the United States has maintained close contacts, mill-to-mill contacts with the Russians to try to prevent those kinds of incidents. And so having that with the Chinese is really important to try to mitigate some of these considerable risks.
Yeah, I mean, the risks are considerable, as you say. I mean, the tension around Taiwan remains. And despite all the rhetoric about economic ties, would you say that the U.S. and China really are preparing for a war against each other one day?
Well, I think I don't see evidence that either country actually really wants a war. I think that's important to distinguish from preparing for the possibility. I think we see signs that neither is particularly interested in a war or would like to avoid it. But these are both, frankly, countries that are preparing for that possibility. Which is what countries tend to do. And one of the real dangers here is that in making these preparations out of a national security imperative, that we don't end up sort of in a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think, when you look at the summit and what was achieved, I think from the Chinese perspective, one of the things that was achieved is Biden reaffirming the one China policy. That was clearly something that was important for the Chinese.
I want us to talk now for a moment about the economics of this relationship. Last year, you wrote an article in The Diplomat, and in that you write, the Biden administration strategy for addressing the China challenge is lacking. There is no strategy, at least no credible strategy, without robust economic statecraft. For our viewers, tell us, what is a robust economic statecraft? What does it look like?
Yes, so one of the things that is really tragic is that in the last, 5-7 years, the United States has really stepped back from free trade policy. But the world is moving on without the United States. So there's now two major regional free trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States is not a party to either of them. And in place of the United States, China is assuming a greater and greater role in the economic sphere and in its relationship with countries. And the United States is really just on the sidelines. And then in this way, we're losing a lot of leverage and influence in the region. And, I was really very disappointed and sad to see that the Biden administration had announced something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was to try to be, frankly, a poor substitute for these other regional free trade agreements. But even now, that is reportedly on hold.
So in your opinion, the United States is not doing enough to make itself more attractive than China is to other Southeastern economies when it comes to trade relations?
Yes, I think what you're seeing is that both sides are really leaning into what they see as their comparative advantage. China sees its comparative advantage as that economic relationship, and the United States sees its comparative advantage as security and defense.
I know that you have also written that Americans will have to possibly make sacrifices to meet the Chinese challenge one day, but you say sacrificing free trade with Asia is not one of them. Now, does that mean in the future you'll still be able to go to Walmart, you'll still be able to get things cheap, but they won't have made in China on them anymore, maybe made in Vietnam?
Perhaps. I think one of the things I was trying to say with that is there's a perception here that the United States has not benefited from free trade. We have benefited enormously from free trade. And I think it's unfortunate that there has been some of that belief within the United States domestic population. And so actually free trade supports U.S. interests. It supports the interests of the average worker. And whether, as you say, that in the future goods are going to be made with China or they're going to be made with many other nations in the Indo-Pacific, that's actually all a benefit to the U.S. economy.
I'd like to get your take on what we saw happening at this summit. When the sun set, it was time for dinner. A lot of Silicon Valley CEOs had dinner with Xi Jinping. And I'm wondering who is courting whom these days when these two elements come together?
That's a great question. In some respects, I think they probably wonder themselves. I think, right now, China is in an economic downturn. It's struggling, recovering, coming out of COVID. It has very high economic unemployment rates among its younger population. And so, I would normally say perhaps it's even more so the CEOs courting China. But frankly, I think a big reason we had this sort of diplomatic exchange is because Chinese government is very concerned about their economic situation. And that's why you're seeing this outreach.
And James, you lived and worked in China for some 10 years. So talk us through this meeting today. What do you make of it so far?
Well, Sally, I was in the camp with low expectations, and I would say I'd give both leaders at least an A-, which is pretty good. I'm probably a stiff grader. It's still about optics. If you look at the last 5 diplomatic meetings between the U.S. and China, they've mostly been nothing burgers, to use a technical term. Good photo ops, but not really a lot of substance. But already, the first session, there are 2 more closed-door sessions, by the way, but this first session, we had military-to-military dialogue restored. And importantly, as a China watcher, if I look in the Chinese media, the social media and the official media, they're praising the U.S. for the past 2 weeks. I mean, of course, they're going to do that because Xi's not going to go to a country that's a mess, right? They want to make it look good, but it's quite a turnaround from a month ago, I would say. So we're seeing a big shift in the propaganda. We've got at least one concrete win. I'm not sure how much more we're going to get, but I'm happy with that.
In terms of, trade, which of course is so critical for both economies, there's a lot been going on, in particular, US restrictions on semiconductors, etc. There are a lot of big bosses from the technology sector in this dinner just now with President Xi. What do you think maybe have achieved in terms of trade?
Well, the big bosses have power to lobby, and that's it. I don't think Biden, I don't think the U.S. government is going to bend too much on those export restrictions. They found out the hard way that if you've got a list of bad companies at a country you don't sell to, but you sell to good companies there. If this is an authoritarian regime like China is, the government has the right to force those good companies to transfer their technology into those ones that were on the blacklist. And that's clear what's happened. It demonstrates that export controls are really hard to enforce with an authoritarian regime, So I don't know that those tech leaders have a lot of lobbying sway at this point. I think they've paid $40,000 a seat, which is not cheap for people like you and me, but I guess for them, they got the money. But I think it's more for optics. I think it's more for visibility. I don't see the U.S. bending much on trade, even though that's what Xi Jinping probably most wants.